This bug can live in the Arctic. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Bug of the Week. And this week, we're talking about a really cool order that is very little known, and I know you guys will think they're pretty cool. Before we get into it, as always, if you are new here and you enjoy something about this video, definitely consider leaving a like and subscribing, maybe leaving a comment. It helps us out a lot. Also, consider checking out our website, and it'll tell you a little bit more about what Lil Dudes Insect Academy is all about and why we're here. But anyways, enough jibber jabber, let's get into it. So last week we talked about Mantophasmatodea, and this order, Grylloblattodea, is the closest living relative. Similar to the Mantophasmatodea, the Grylloblattodea is a very small order, only having about 60 species so far worldwide. Before the Mantophasmatodea, the Grylloblattodea is actually the second most recently described insect order. So there are a lot of similarities between these two orders, both the story of how their order was first described, and also a lot of morphological and genetic similarities as well, which is why we have placed them so close together on the phylogeny, because they're closely related. So first of all, the name, Grylloblattodea, another mouthful, is derived from the Greek of gryll, meaning cricket, and blatta, meaning cockroach, which we haven't gotten to the cockroach yet, but their order name is Blattodea, so there it is. So Grylloblattodea basically meaning cricket cockroach, and that's just because they look kind of like a mix between a cricket and a cockroach. And I would add earwig, the Dermaptera, which we've talked about before, because they sort of look like them as well. So first, let's get the anatomy out of the way, because what really gets interesting is some of the behaviors and lifestyles that they have. So from an anatomy perspective, I would say these bugs are pretty boring, pretty not sensational in their appearances. They have a long cylindrical body, mandibulate mouth parts, which are outside of their head cavity, 5 segmented tarsi, just like the Mantophasmatodea, and the tarsi, of course, are basically the feet of the insect, and they have long 8 segmented cerci. So that's something that's kind of interesting. We see cerci kind of come back in this group, whereas the last several orders we've talked about, cerci have kind of gone away for the most part, or been heavily reduced. So that's something that's kind of interesting. They come back in full force in this order. And just like the Mantophasmatodea that we talked about last week, the Grylloblattodea are also wingless, which is really weird. So I talked about this in the last video, so if you missed that one, go check that one out after you're done with this one. But basically, these insects have lost their wings. So it's thought that the ancestors of these insects had wings, but these ones living today do not. So they're still insects, but they're something that we call secondarily apterous, meaning that they have since lost their wings, but their ancestors had wings. So yes, they're still insects, they're just wingless insects. Finally, to round out the anatomy, the eyes of these insects are very small, heavily reduced, sort of dot, small compound eyes. These insects are really cool and interesting because of where they live. So if you typically think about where insects live, it's typically, a warm, tropical, desert, or, typically you would associate the summertime with insects. If you live in an area where there's a harsh winter, you kind of see the bugs disappear in the wintertime, but not these guys. You might have noticed I have not mentioned the common name of these insects, but the common name is ice crawlers or ice bugs, and that is because they live in icy climates. So yes, this entire order specializes in living in an extreme environment that no other insect typically lives. So ice crawlers are what biologists would call extremophiles, meaning they're an organism that lives in an extreme environment that other members of a similar related group typically wouldn't live. So some examples of extremophiles would be like these bacteria that live around hydrothermal vents, which are, very hot, extreme environment, right? You wouldn't expect anything to live there, but there's some bacteria that live there. Another example are some nematodes that live in very acidic water. And then, of course, the microbiota in our stomachs, that's a very acidic environment, and so not a lot of things want to live there, but there are these things that specialize in living there. So the ice crawlers are a prime example of that. You don't typically see insects in an icy environment, but these insects thrive. So if you think about this from a life history perspective, it's really, really cool and really interesting, because if you think about it, if you're the only insect that lives a certain in a certain area or range, you don't have any competition, or virtually any competition, with any other insects. And so they're able to exploit this really weird niche that a lot of other insects aren't able to even live in. So typically what happens is the fall and the winter come, and the insects either die or have already died after mating for the year. But these insects are the opposite. Some of them come out and have their life cycle in the winter, but some of them actually live in Arctic regions where it is always icy. There's a permafrost, and they specialize in living in this crazy extreme environment. So from an ecological standpoint, it's really, really cool, because they're able to do all these things that insects aren't typically able to do. So these are often found in the high elevations in the mountains of China, Siberia, Japan, and even the western United States, and up in Canada, where it is very snowy for a long period of time throughout the year. There are also cave-dwelling species in Korea and Japan, which are very cool because they live in a very cold but not necessarily icy environment. So these insects, as all the other ones we've been talking about throughout the series, are hemimetabolists, meaning they have an incomplete 3-stage metamorphosis going from egg to nymph to adult. I've talked about this dozens of times. So another cool thing is these insects are actually omnivorous, which makes sense because there's not really much to eat in an Arctic environment. And so they are omnivorous. They'll eat decaying plant matter, detritus, decaying animal matter, and even some examples of them eating live insects. Rock crawlers also will migrate to avoid the hotter times of the year, and so they will move downward and upward through mountains to find where the permafrost is during the warm seasons, which is really, really cool. Most species of Grylloblattodea are active below freezing and die when it reaches above 10 degrees Celsius. They really thrive at freezing temperatures, and I've heard that if you find one and you pick it up, it can actually die from the body heat of your hand, which is really interesting and really demonstrates how sensitive they are to temperature. So here's the big question. How do they do it? How are they even able to survive in these freezing temperatures? How do they not just freeze from the inside out? This is an especially difficult challenge for insects, because the insides of insects are basically just liquid sloshing around. I can cover the circulatory system of insects a little later, but essentially, the inside of an insect is mostly liquid, sloshing around. It's called hemolymph, and it's basically the blood of the insect. But they don't have veins or arteries, so it's just openly circulating in their body cavity. And so this hemolymph is pretty easy to freeze, and so that's why most insects can't survive the winter unless they have some sort of nest or colony structure. But the Grylloblattodea are an exception to this rule, because in their hemolymph they have something called antifreeze proteins, also known as AFPs. AFPs are present in some insects, many fishes, fungi, and bacteria that prevent the organism from freezing from the inside out. So these AFPs protect against freezing by binding to the initial ice crystals that are forming inside the hemolymph, and this binding leads to an increased surface curvature of ice crystals that lowers the freezing point and obstructs further ice formation. So these proteins essentially attack young ice crystals before they're able to grow. And so that's how the Grylloblattodea are able to survive in freezing temperatures. Super cool, super bizarre, and this is persistent in this entire order. So yeah, really, really cool. Now, of course, this does have a limit. So we see the optimal living temperature of the Grylloblattodea to be between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius, and that's 34 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit. And so they will be killed at colder temperature due to ice formation outside the body, it kind of encapsulating them, and that becomes an issue for breathing or respiration. So they do have a limit, obviously, but this is way lower than most other insects would be. So the Grylloblattodea, the ice crawlers, are super cool, super interesting, a little order that a lot of people might not know about. But yeah, now you know. Some insects can live in Arctic areas because that's the cool thing about insects, is they inhabit basically every corner of the earth. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed this episode. If you did, leave a like, subscribe, and comment your favorite fun fact about the Grylloblattodea. Next week, we are covering the Embioptera, or the web spinners. So if you don't want to miss that one, definitely subscribe so you don't miss it. But with that, I will see you all next week. But until then, keep on bugging. See ya.